My name is Zara Blackwood, and 4 years ago, I was the smallest soldier in the 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, a 5'2" Montana girl who everyone said had no business carrying a rifle in Afghanistan. What they didn't know was that one impossible shot from my position would end a 3-month siege and change the course of an entire war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk 4 years ago, before the medals and the newspaper headlines, before the Congressional hearing and the documentary crew that followed me around for 6 months, I was just another waitress at the Rusty Spoon Café in Millfield, Montana. Population 1,247 on a good day, where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night high school football game and the annual county fair that brought visitors from 3 neighboring towns. At 22, I'd been slinging coffee and pie to ranchers, truckers, and the occasional lost tourist for 5 years, ever since I graduated high school and realized that my dreams of college were going to stay dreams unless I could figure out how to pay for them myself. My paycheck barely covered the rent on my tiny apartment above Murphy's hardware store, and my savings account had exactly $347 in it, money I'd been setting aside $50 at a time whenever I could manage it. Most people in Millfield saw me exactly the way I looked, a petite girl with calloused hands and coffee-stained aprons, someone who smiled politely at crude jokes from drunk cowboys and pretended not to hear the whispered comments about how I'd probably end up marrying some local ranch hand and having kids before I turned 25. They weren't being mean, exactly. They just couldn't imagine that someone like me might want something bigger than what Millfield had to offer. What they didn't know, what nobody except my father knew, was that every Saturday morning at 5 a.m., I drove 40 minutes into the Montana wilderness to a private shooting range that my dad had built on our family's abandoned mining claim. There, surrounded by nothing but mountain peaks and endless sky, my father, Victor Blackwood, taught me the art of precision shooting that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam as an Army sniper. Dad was a quiet man who carried his war like a weight he'd learned to balance, but never put down. He'd come home from Southeast Asia in 1971 to a country that didn't want to hear his stories and a job market that wasn't interested in his particular set of skills. He'd found work at the copper mine, married my mother Sarah, and raised me with the kind of patient discipline that only comes from someone who understands the difference between hardship and inconvenience. Shooting isn't about the gun, Zara. He'd tell me while I learned to control my breathing and find that space between heartbeats where perfect shots live. It's about becoming so still inside that you can hear your own pulse and time it with the trigger pull. Most people rush. They think louder and faster means better. But the best shots come from the quietest places. He'd taught me to read wind patterns by watching grass bend and trees sway, to calculate distance by understanding how heat shimmer affects visibility, to compensate for elevation and humidity and a dozen other variables that most people never think about. By the time I turned 18, I could hit a target the size of a dinner plate at 800 meters with equipment that Vietnam-era snipers would have considered miraculous. But in Millfield, Montana, exceptional marksmanship was just an interesting hobby for a girl who was expected to have more practical concerns. The local boys who knew about my shooting skills thought it was cute or impressive for a girl, but none of them imagined it might be anything more than weekend entertainment. The idea that precision shooting could be a career, a calling, or a way to serve something bigger than myself never came up in conversations about my future. The decision to enlist came during a particularly brutal shift at the Rusty Spoon, when a table of college kids from Missoula spent 2 hours treating me like I was invisible except when they needed refills. They talked loudly about their internships and study abroad programs and post-graduation plans, casually discussing opportunities that might As well have been on another planet for someone in my situation. As I wiped down their table after they left without tipping, naturally, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window reflection. 22 years old, wearing a uniform that smelled like grease and coffee, in a town where the most exciting thing that had happened in the past decade was when the Walmart finally opened 30 miles away in the county seat. That night, I sat on my apartment's fire escape and called my dad. "I've been thinking about the Army," I told him, the words coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. There was a long pause before he answered. "The Army's not the same as it was when I served. Zara, they've got opportunities now that didn't exist in my day. But it's still the Army. You sure this isn't just about wanting to get out of Millfield?" "Maybe it started that way," I admitted. "But I keep thinking about what you taught me. About precision and discipline, and serving something bigger than yourself. I'm good at this, Dad. Really good. And I'm tired of pretending that doesn't matter." Another pause, longer this time. "If you're serious about this, we need to get you ready. Army standards are different from Saturday morning practice. You'll need to be better than good. You'll need to be undeniable." For the next 6 months, while I continued working at the cafe and saving every penny I could, Dad put me through a training regimen that transformed Saturday morning lessons into something approaching military preparation. We worked on physical conditioning because carrying military gear required strength I'd never needed for waitressing. We practiced shooting in adverse conditions, rain, low light, and extreme cold that made my fingers numb and my eyes water. More importantly, he prepared me mentally for what it would be like to be a woman in a male-dominated environment, where proving yourself wasn't a one-time event, but a daily requirement. "You're going to be smaller than everyone else," he told me during one particularly challenging training session where I'd spent 4 hours hitting targets at distances that most recreational shooters never attempt. "They're going to see that as a weakness before they see it as an advantage. You'll have to be twice as good to get half the recognition, and even then, some people will never admit you belong." His words proved prophetic in ways that neither of us could have anticipated. When I finally walked into the Army recruitment office in Helena, wearing my best clothes and carrying documentation of shooting competitions I'd won across 3 states, the recruiter's first response was to ask if I was there to inquire about my boyfriend's enlistment status. "No, sir," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the familiar sting of assumption. "I'm here to enlist infantry with the goal of qualifying for sniper school." Staff Sergeant Morrison, no relation to the Captain Morrison from my later story, looked at me like I'd asked to enlist in the Space Force. "Miss, infantry is a combat position. Are you sure you wouldn't be more interested in communications, logistics, or medical? We have excellent programs for young women with your ... background." The pause before background carried the weight of every assumption he'd made about small-town girls who probably weren't serious about military service. But I'd prepared for this conversation, had practiced it with my father until I could deliver my qualifications without sounding defensive or desperate. "Sergeant, I've won the Montana State Long Range Shooting Championship 3 years running. I hold the civilian record at Glacier National Park's 1,000-meter range. I can field strip and reassemble an M24 sniper rifle in under 4 minutes, and I've been training with military standard equipment since I was 16. I pulled out a folder containing certificates, competition results, and photographs of me with various rifles and trophies. I understand that infantry is demanding, but I believe my skill set would be valuable to the Army sniper program." Sergeant Morrison flipped through the documentation with growing surprise, his expression shifting from dismissive to genuinely curious. "These scores are impressive," he admitted. "But military shooting is different from competition shooting. Combat adds variables that can't be simulated in civilian training." "I understand that, Sergeant. That's why I want professional training." I want to serve my country and use the skills I have in a way that makes a difference. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and ended with my signature on an enlistment contract with an Infantry Option 11X that would give me the opportunity to try for sniper school after completing basic training and advanced individual training. It was the first step on a journey that would take me from the mountains of Montana to the deserts of Afghanistan, where the shooting skills my father had taught me would be tested in ways that no competition or training exercise could prepare me for. As I drove home from Helena that afternoon, with my enlistment papers in the passenger seat and my father's proud voice still echoing from our phone call, I had no idea that within 18 months, I'd be lying in a sniper's hide overlooking a Taliban stronghold, preparing to take a shot that would end a siege and prove that excellence doesn't have a predetermined size, gender, or background. The girl in the Rusty Spoon Café uniform was about to become something that most people, including myself, never imagined possible. But first, I had to survive the process of proving that I belonged in a world where being underestimated was just another obstacle to overcome. Fort Benning, Georgia, in August feels like stepping into a blast furnace operated by people who think you're not suffering enough yet. The bus that delivered our platoon from the airport was air-conditioned, which turned out to be the last comfort I'd experience for the next 14 weeks. As we filed off into the Georgia humidity that hit like a physical wall, I got my first taste of what the next few months would bring. Listen up, future soldiers. The voice belonged to Drill Sergeant Martinez, a compact man whose presence seemed to fill the entire formation area despite being maybe 5'6" himself. You are no longer civilians. You are no longer individuals. You are raw material, and we are going to shape you into something the United States Army can actually use. I stood in the formation surrounded by young men and women from every conceivable background: farm kids from Iowa, city kids from Detroit, college dropouts, high school graduates, and everything in between. What united us was the deer-in-headlights expression that comes from realizing you've just signed away the next several years of your life to people who are professionally committed to testing your limits. The initial processing was a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, equipment issue, and constant movement from one station to another. But it was during the administrative interviews that I got my first real indication of how my journey was going to unfold. Blackwood, the sergeant processing my paperwork, called out, reading from a computer screen. "Says here you want infantry. With an option 11X for sniper school. That right?" "Yes, Sergeant." He looked up from the screen for the first time, taking in my 5'2" frame and probably wondering if there had been some kind of clerical error. "You sure about that? We've got some excellent opportunities in logistics, communications, military, intelligence, jobs that might be more suited to your skill set." There was that pause again, the same one I'd heard from the recruiter in Montana. The assumption that my skill set couldn't possibly include the physical and mental demands of infantry combat. "I'm sure, Sergeant. I qualified expert on the ASVAB, and my physical fitness scores from EPS were well above the minimums for infantry." "Minimums aren't the same as realistic expectations," he replied, making a note on my file. "But that's between you and your drill sergeants. Good luck." The first few weeks of basic training were an education in how quickly assumptions can spread through a military unit. Word traveled fast that one of the female recruits had requested infantry and sniper school, and the reaction ranged from amusement to outright skepticism. "Blackwood thinks she's going to be a sniper," I overheard Private Webb telling a group during chow. "Someone should explain to her that this isn't a video game." Private Garrett, a former college football player from Texas, who towered over me by more than a foot, was more direct in his assessment. "No offense, Blackwood, but you realize snipers have to carry like 80 pounds of gear for miles through enemy territory. You sure you didn't mean to sign up for the Air Force?" The comments weren't necessarily malicious. Most of them came from genuine confusion about how someone my size could handle the physical demands of infantry combat. But they established a pattern that would follow me throughout my military career, the assumption that my ambitions were unrealistic, and that someone should help me understand my limitations before I embarrassed myself. The physical training was brutal for everyone, but it was especially challenging for someone who weighed 118 pounds soaking wet. The ruck marches long-distance hikes carrying full combat gear were exercises in pain, management, and mental toughness that tested every ounce of conditioning my father had put me through in Montana during our first major ruck march, a 12-mile trek through the Georgia pine forests carrying 60 pounds of equipment. I fell behind the main group despite pushing myself to the point of near collapse. Drill Sergeant Martinez appeared beside me around mile 8, matching my pace with the effortless stride of someone who could probably complete the march backwards while singing cadence. Having second thoughts about infantry, Blackwood. "No, Drill Sergeant," I gasped, forcing my legs to keep moving despite the burning sensation that had spread from my shoulders to my lower back. "Good, because every time you fall behind, you give ammunition to people who think you don't belong. Here, the question is whether you're going to prove them right or prove them wrong." His words hit harder than any insult could have. He wasn't questioning my determination. He was challenging me to use the doubt as fuel rather than letting it defeat me. I finished that ruck march 15 minutes behind the main group, but I finished it. More importantly, I learned something about the difference between being physically smaller and being mentally weaker. The ruck might have hurt more because I was carrying a higher percentage of my body weight, but the pain was temporary. The satisfaction of completing something that people assumed I couldn't handle would last much longer. The marksmanship training at Fort Benning was where I first began to distinguish myself from my peers. While other recruits struggled with the fundamentals of rifle shooting, breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, I was hitting targets at distances that impressed even the drill sergeants. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that, Blackwood?" Drill Sergeant Foster asked after I'd scored expert on the rifle qualification course with a score that put me in the top 3 of our entire company. "My father taught me, Drill Sergeant. He was a sniper in Vietnam." "That explains the fundamentals," he said, studying my target through binoculars. "But this is natural talent on top of good training. You ever think about putting in for the marksmanship unit?" "I want infantry first. Drill sergeant, sniper school after that." He lowered the binoculars and looked at me with something approaching respect. "Infantry's going to test you in ways that shooting competitions never will. You ready for that?" "I think so, Drill Sergeant." "Thinking isn't good enough. You need to know. Because if you wash out of infantry, it's going to be a long time before anyone takes another female applicant seriously for sniper school." The weight of that responsibility, representing not just myself but future women who might want to follow the same path, was something I hadn't fully considered when I'd signed my enlistment papers. But it became a constant presence throughout the rest of basic training, adding pressure to every physical test, every field exercise, every moment where my performance might be used as evidence of what women could or couldn't handle in combat. Roles. The final field training exercise was a week-long simulation of combat operations that tested everything we'd learned about tactics, marksmanship, and working as a unit under stress. Our platoon was divided into squads and given objectives that required movement through dense forest, establishment of defensive positions, and engagement of simulated enemy forces. I was assigned to a fire team led by Private Palmer, a former Marine who joined the Army to pursue special operations opportunities. Palmer made his expectations clear from the beginning. "Blackwood, I know you can shoot, but this isn't about individual performance. It's about team movement and mutual support. Stay close, follow orders, and try not to slow us down." The exercise began before dawn with a 12-mile movement to our initial objective, a simulated enemy outpost that we were supposed to observe and report on without being detected. The terrain was challenging, involving stream crossings, steep hills, and thick vegetation that made silent movement nearly impossible. 3 hours into the movement, our point man stepped into a hidden observer position manned by drill sergeants, playing enemy forces. The contact that followed was a chaos of blank ammunition, smoke grenades, and shouted commands that tested our ability to react under pressure. Contact front. Blackwood, establish overwatch on that tree line. Palmer's. Command set me scrambling up a small hill to a position where I could provide covering fire for the team's movement. Through my rifle scope, I could see the positions where drill sergeants were simulating enemy fire, and I began engaging targets with the precision that had impressed everyone during marksmanship training. Target eliminated. Came the call from the exercise controller. Nice shooting, Blackwood. But it was what happened after the firefight that really mattered. As we consolidated our position and treated simulated casualties, Palmer pulled me aside for a conversation that would stay with me throughout my military career. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I was expecting you to be a liability, but you performed like a soldier. Better than most, actually. Thank you, Palmer. Don't thank me yet. This was just training. The real test comes when you get to your first duty assignment and have to prove yourself all over again to people who don't know what you can do." His words proved prophetic 6 months later when I completed advanced individual training and received orders to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division. But more importantly, those orders came with an assignment to a unit that was scheduled for deployment to Afghanistan within 12 months. The girl from Montana, who'd served coffee to ranchers and tourists, was about to become an infantry soldier, heading to war. And despite the doubts, the assumptions, and the constant pressure to prove myself, I was ready for whatever came next, or at least I thought I was. Fort Campbell, Kentucky, sprawls across 105,000 acres of rolling hills and military infrastructure that houses the legendary 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, whose history includes some of the most famous battles in American military history. Arriving there as a newly minted infantry soldier felt like stepping into a different universe, one where the stakes were real and the margin for error had disappeared entirely. My assignment was to Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment, a unit with a combat deployment schedule that had them rotating to Afghanistan every 18 months like clockwork. The company commander, Captain Sullivan, was a West Point graduate on his 3rd combat tour who'd earned a Bronze Star for actions during the previous deployment. His reputation preceded him, a demanding leader who expected excellence and had little patience for soldiers who couldn't meet the standard. "Private Blackwood," he said during my initial in-processing interview, reviewing my personnel file with the clinical precision of someone who'd evaluated hundreds of new soldiers. "Says here you're interested in sniper school. That's an ambitious goal for someone with no combat experience." "Yes, sir. I understand the requirements and I'm prepared to meet them." Captain Sullivan looked up from the file, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to read character and features. "The requirements aren't just about marksmanship, Private. Combat changes everything. The best range shooter in the world can fall apart the first time someone shoots back. Are you prepared for that reality?" His question wasn't meant to discourage me. It was meant to ensure I understood what I was asking for. "I believe so, sir. My father served as a sniper in Vietnam, and he's tried to prepare me mentally for what combat entails. Your father's experience will help, but ultimately, this is something you'll have to prove to yourself and to your unit. We deploy to Afghanistan in 8 months. Use that time wisely." The 8 months that followed were a compressed education in everything the Army hadn't taught me during basic and advanced training. Pre-deployment preparation involved advanced marksmanship courses, urban warfare training, cultural awareness, classes about Afghanistan, and physical conditioning that made basic training look like summer camp, but it was the social dynamics of the unit that provided the most challenging education. My platoon consisted of 28 soldiers, including 3 other women assigned to support roles, none in infantry positions. The men ranged from 18-year-old privates on their first assignment to seasoned sergeants with multiple combat deployments. What they shared was a skepticism about having a female soldier in an infantry role, especially one with aspirations beyond her apparent capabilities. Staff Sergeant Donovan, my squad leader, was a 30-year-old career soldier from Ohio who'd served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. His approach to leadership was straightforward: earn respect through performance, accept criticism as feedback, and never ask for special treatment because of circumstances beyond your control. Blackwood, he told me after my first week with the unit, I don't care what's between your legs or how tall you are. What I care about is whether you can do your job when it matters. But I need you to understand something: every time you screw up, there are going to be people who blame it on you being a woman rather than you being inexperienced. That's not fair, but it's reality. His words proved accurate during advanced marksmanship training at Fort Knox, where our entire company spent 2 weeks learning urban sniper tactics and advanced shooting techniques. The course was designed to identify potential candidates for sniper school, while giving everyone enhanced marksmanship skills for deployment. I excelled at every phase of the training: long-range precision shooting, urban hide construction, target identification, and ballistics calculations. My scores were consistently in the top 5% of the class, often outperforming soldiers with years more experience. But rather than earning universal recognition, my success generated a different kind of attention. Blackwood's getting special treatment from the instructors. I overheard Private Kane telling a group during evening chow, "They're going easy on her because she's the diversity experiment." Private Webb, who'd been skeptical since basic training, was more direct. "I'm not saying she can't shoot, but range performance doesn't translate to combat effectiveness. Wait until someone's shooting back and see how well she handles pressure." The comments stung because they dismissed legitimate achievement as artificial advantage, but they also motivated me to push harder. During the final evaluation, a complex scenario involving target identification and engagement at multiple distances under time pressure, I achieved a perfect score, while several more experienced soldiers struggled with the demanding requirements. Master Sergeant Foster, the senior instructor, pulled me aside after the exercise. "Blackwood, that was exceptional work. Have you given serious thought to putting in your packet for sniper school?" "Yes, Master Sergeant. That's been my goal since enlisting." "Your marksmanship is certainly at the required level, but sniper school is about more than shooting. It's about operating independently under extreme pressure, often for days at a time with minimal support. The psychological demands are as challenging as the physical ones." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You'll also be the first woman to attempt the course, which means you'll be under scrutiny that male candidates don't face. Are you prepared for that additional pressure?" The question highlighted something I'd been avoiding thinking about: the weight of being a pioneer in a field where failure would impact more than just my own career. If I washed out of sniper school, it might be years before another woman was given the opportunity. "I understand the pressure, Master Sergeant, but I'd rather fail attempting something I'm passionate about than succeed at something I settled for." His smile suggested he'd been hoping for exactly that answer. "Good. We'll start the paperwork when you get back from deployment. Combat experience is a prerequisite, so use your time in Afghanistan wisely." The pre-deployment training intensified as our departure date approached. We practiced convoy operations, improvised explosive device recognition, medical evacuation procedures, and close quarters combat. But it was during cultural awareness training that I got my first real understanding of what we'd be facing in Afghanistan. The instructor, a civilian contractor who'd spent 5 years working with Afghan security forces, painted a picture of a country exhausted by decades of war, but still capable of producing fighters who knew every rock and tree and terrain. That would be completely foreign to American soldiers. The Taliban aren't the primitive force that some people imagine, he explained. They're experienced guerrilla fighters who've been perfecting their tactics for 20 years. They know how to use terrain, weather, and local support to their advantage. They're patient, disciplined, and highly motivated. He clicked through slides showing the mountainous terrain of Helmand Province, where our unit would be operating. This is some of the most challenging terrain in the world for military operations. Extreme elevation changes, limited visibility, and an enemy who's been fighting in these mountains since before some of you were born. The briefing continued with information about Forward Operating Base Sentinel, our destination in Helmand Province. The base was located in a valley surrounded by hills that provided natural observation points for enemy forces. Recent intelligence suggested increased Taliban activity in the area, with particular concern about a well-trained sniper team that had been targeting coalition forces with increasing effectiveness. Your mission will involve establishing security for reconstruction efforts while conducting counterinsurgency operations against Taliban forces in the region, the briefing officer explained. This isn't Iraq, where you might go weeks without significant contact. In Helmand, you should expect regular engagement with enemy forces who know the terrain better than you do and have had years to prepare defensive positions. As our deployment date approached, the training became more realistic and the stakes more apparent. We conducted live-fire exercises that simulated the mountain warfare we'd face in Afghanistan, practiced medical procedures for treating combat casualties, and rehearsed the kind of small unit tactics that would keep us alive in a hostile environment. During our final field training exercise, a week-long simulation of Afghan operations conducted in the mountains of Tennessee, I got my first taste of what real combat might demand. The exercise involved establishing patrol bases, conducting reconnaissance missions, and engaging simulated enemy forces in terrain that approximated what we'd face overseas. It was during this exercise that I first worked closely with Corporal Nash, a seasoned soldier who would later become my spotter and closest friend in Afghanistan. Nash was a 25-year-old from Oregon who'd been selected for additional marksmanship training based on his performance during previous deployments. Blackwood, he said during a break between training scenarios, I've been watching your shooting, and I have to admit I'm impressed. But I'm curious, what makes you think you want to be a sniper? It's not just about making long shots. You spend days lying in the dirt, eating one meal a day, and waiting for targets that might never appear. His question was genuine rather than challenging, coming from someone who understood the realities of precision shooting in combat rather than assumptions about what women could or couldn't handle. I'm good at it, I replied simply. And I think being good at something that can save lives and complete missions makes it worth the discomfort. Fair enough. When we get to Afghanistan, stick close. I'll teach you things about combat shooting that they don't cover in any manual. 2 weeks later, we boarded a transport plane at Fort Campbell for the first leg of our journey to Afghanistan. As the aircraft lifted off from Kentucky soil, carrying us toward a war that would test everything I'd learned and everything I believed about myself, I thought about my father's words from our last conversation before deployment. Remember, he'd told me, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. The mountains of Afghanistan are going to teach you things about yourself that you never knew. Make sure you're ready to learn. The soldier from Montana was about to discover just how much she still had to learn. The first thing that hits you about Afghanistan isn't the heat or the dust, or even the smell of diesel fuel and burning trash that seems to permeate every military base. It's the mountains. They rise from the desert floor like ancient monuments. To human insignificance, their peaks disappearing into clouds that seem impossibly high and impossibly distant. Standing on the flight line at Bagram Air Base, waiting for the helicopter that would take us to Forward Operating Base Sentinel, I understood for the first time why this country had been defeating invading armies for centuries. The helicopter ride to Phobie Sentinel took 45 minutes through mountain passes that seemed designed to remind passengers of their mortality. Our pilot, a warrant officer who'd been flying in Afghanistan for 3 years, provided commentary over the intercom that mixed tactical information with dark humor. "Those hills to the east have been active lately," he announced as we banked around a particularly imposing ridgeline. "Taliban sniper team has been taking shots at our birds. Nothing successful yet, but they're learning our flight patterns. Everyone keep your heads down and your gear secure." Through the small window, I could see villages tucked into valley floors, their mud brick buildings blending seamlessly with the terrain until they seemed like natural formations rather than human habitation. Occasionally, figures would emerge from buildings to watch our helicopter pass overhead, some waving, others simply observing with the patient attention of people who'd been watching foreign soldiers come and go for decades. Forward Operating Base Sentinel sat in a valley surrounded by hills that provided natural observation points for anyone interested in monitoring our activities. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and guard towers connected by dirt roads that turned to mud during the brief rainy season and dust storms during the rest of the year. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, the base commander, briefed our company during our first day in country. Pierce was a career infantry officer whose third combat deployment had taught him that Afghanistan operated according to rules that weren't covered in any field manual. "Welcome to Helmand Province," he began, standing in front of a map that showed the tactical situation surrounding our base. "Your mission here is to provide security for reconstruction efforts while conducting counterinsurgency operations against Taliban forces in the region. The enemy you'll be facing is experienced, well-equipped, and intimately familiar with terrain that will be completely foreign to you." He clicked to a slide showing casualty statistics from the previous unit's deployment. "The Taliban in this area are particularly effective at long-range engagements. They've been using sniper tactics to target our patrols, supply convoys, and anyone foolish enough to present a static target for more than a few seconds." The briefing continued with information about local villages, tribal dynamics, and the complex political situation that made distinguishing between civilians and combatants a constant challenge. But it was the intelligence about enemy sniper activity that captured my attention most completely. "We believe there's a Taliban sniper team operating in the mountains east of the base," Pierce explained. "They've been responsible for at least 6 coalition casualties in the past 2 months, all single shots at ranges exceeding 800 meters. The shooter is skilled, disciplined, and patient, a combination that makes him extremely dangerous." After the briefing, Staff Sergeant Donovan pulled me aside for a conversation that would define my role during the deployment. "Blackwood, I've been thinking about how to best utilize your skills," he said, leading me to a sandbagged position that provided overwatch of the base's eastern approaches. "Your marksmanship scores suggest you might be able to counter this sniper threat, but I need to know you're ready for what that means." "What do you mean, Staff Sergeant?" "I mean that if you take a shot in combat, it's not going to be at a paper target. It's going to be at another human being who's trying to kill your friends. Are you prepared for that psychological reality?" The question had been hanging over me since enlisting, but hearing it stated so directly in a place where the stakes were real rather than theoretical made it impossible to avoid. "I think so, Staff Sergeant. My father tried to prepare me mentally for what combat would require. Your father's guidance will help, but ultimately, this is something you'll have to discover about yourself." What I can tell you is that hesitation gets people killed. When the moment comes, you'll need to act without doubt or second guessing. My first patrol into the surrounding countryside came 3 days later, a routine reconnaissance mission designed to familiarize new arrivals with the terrain and local conditions. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers led by Sergeant Martinez, a veteran of 2 previous Afghan deployments who'd earned a reputation for bringing everyone home alive. Stay alert, stay hydrated, and remember that everything you see could be a potential threat, Martinez briefed us before we left the wire. The Taliban like to use terrain features and civilian structures for cover. They're patient, so they might watch us for days before making a move. The patrol route took us through 2 small villages and across terrain that shifted from rocky desert to agricultural fields fed by ancient irrigation systems. The heat was oppressive, even in early morning, and the weight of combat gear made every step a conscious effort. It was during our movement through the second village that I got my first real taste of the psychological complexity of Afghan operations. Children ran alongside our patrol, some begging for candy or water, others simply curious about the foreign soldiers walking through their streets. Women watched from doorways with expressions that seemed to mix caution with resignation. Men gathered in small groups, their conversations stopping as we approached and resuming after we passed. How do you tell who's friendly and who's not? I asked Corporal Nash, who was walking point for our patrol. You can't, he replied without taking his eyes off the surrounding buildings. That kid asking for candy might be spotting for the Taliban. That old man sitting in the shade might be a former Mujahideen fighter. Or they might just be people trying to live their lives in a war zone. The uncertainty is part of what makes this place so dangerous. Our patrol concluded without incident, but the experience of moving through populated areas where anyone could be a threat was more psychologically demanding than any training exercise I'd experienced. The constant vigilance required to assess every person, every building, every piece of terrain for potential danger was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Back at the base, I found myself drawn to the observation posts that provided overwatch of the surrounding area. During off-duty hours, I would study the terrain through high-powered optics, learning the patterns of civilian movement, identifying potential enemy positions, and familiarizing myself with the complex landscape that might someday serve as a battlefield. It was during one of these observation sessions that Corporal Nash found me in the Eastern Tower, scanning the mountainous terrain where intelligence suggested the Taliban sniper team operated. See anything interesting? He asked, settling in beside me with his own pair of binoculars. Just trying to understand the terrain. If there really is a sniper team out there, where would they set up? How would they approach target areas? What escape routes would they use? Nash nodded approvingly. Those are the right questions. Most soldiers focus on where the enemy might be instead of thinking like the enemy would think. You're approaching this like a hunter rather than a target. He pointed toward a ridgeline approximately 1,200 meters from our position. If I were setting up a hide to observe this base, that's where I'd go. Good elevation, multiple escape routes, and civilian traffic on the road below for cover. As we studied the terrain together, Nash began sharing insights about combat shooting that weren't covered in any manual. How wind patterns changed throughout the day in mountainous terrain. How heat shimmer affected target acquisition at different times. How to read the behavior of local civilians to identify potential threats. The thing about sniping in Afghanistan, he explained, is that it's as much about patience and observation as it is about marksmanship. You might spend days watching an area before getting a single opportunity. And when that opportunity comes, you'll have maybe 3 seconds to identify the threat, calculate the shot, and engage before the target disappears. 3 seconds? If you're lucky. The Taliban fighters we're dealing with aren't amateurs. They know how to use terrain and timing to minimize their exposure. The sniper who's been hitting our patrols probably never presents a target for more than a few seconds at a time. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the distant sound of generator engines and radio chatter from the operations center, I thought about the complexity of what I'd gotten myself into. Afghanistan wasn't just about marksmanship or physical toughness, it was about making life and death decisions under pressure while operating in an environment where the rules changed constantly and the margin for error was measured in lives rather than points. 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine supply convoy, those abstract challenges would become terrifyingly real when the Taliban sniper team made their presence known in a way that left no doubt about their capabilities or their intentions. The war was about to become personal in ways that no amount of training could have prepared me for. The convoy that changed everything was supposed to be routine, a simple supply run to deliver construction materials to a village school being rebuilt as part of the Hearts and Minds campaign. 4 armored vehicles, 20 soldiers, and a route that had been traveled dozens of times without incident. Intelligence reports showed no unusual Taliban activity in the area, and local village elders had expressed support for the reconstruction project. I was riding in the 3rd vehicle as part of Staff Sergeant Donovan's squad, my role officially designated as additional security, but everyone understood I was there primarily to gain combat experience. Corporal Nash sat across from me, his designated marksman rifle secured between his knees, occasionally offering commentary about the terrain we were passing through. "Good ambush country," he noted quietly as we moved through a valley flanked by rocky hills. "If I were planning to hit a convoy, this is where I'd do it. Limited visibility, multiple escape routes, and plenty of cover for shooters." His words proved prophetic 15 minutes later, when the convoy slowed to navigate around a disabled truck that had been abandoned in the middle of the road. The obstacle forced our vehicles into single file, reducing our speed and creating exactly the kind of vulnerable target that Taliban fighters specialized in exploiting. The first shot came from somewhere in the hills to our east, a single, precise round that struck the convoy commander's vehicle with a metallic clang that echoed through the valley like a church bell. The bullet punched through the armored windshield and wounded Lieutenant Harris, our platoon leader, sending blood spattering across the vehicle's interior. "Contact east. Sniper in the hills," came the radio call that transformed our routine supply mission into a combat operation. The convoy immediately implemented anti-sniper procedures, accelerating through the kill zone while soldiers in each vehicle searched for muzzle flashes or other indicators of the shooter's position. But the Taliban sniper had chosen his position well, somewhere in the rocky terrain that provided both concealment and multiple escape routes. A second shot rang out, this one striking the tire of the lead vehicle and forcing it to a grinding halt. The convoy was now trapped in the kill zone, unable to advance or retreat without exposing ourselves to additional precise fire from an enemy we couldn't locate. All vehicles established defensive positions. Dismount and find cover. The order came from Sergeant Martinez, who'd assumed command after Lieutenant Harris was wounded. What followed was a textbook example of how quickly a routine mission could become a life-or-death situation. Soldiers poured from the vehicles, seeking cover behind rocks and in shallow depressions while trying to identify the source of the incoming fire. The sniper was skilled enough to remain hidden while maintaining the ability to engage targets at will. A third shot struck the ground near Private Webb's position, sending shards of rock flying and demonstrating the enemy shooter's ability to place rounds wherever he chose. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical threat, knowing that somewhere in the surrounding hills was someone with the skill to kill any of us at any moment. "Nash Blackwood!" Staff Sergeant Donovan's voice carried over the Kigo. "Chaos. We need counter-sniper fire. Can you locate the shooter?" Corporal Nash and I moved to a position that provided observation of the eastern hills where the shots had originated. Using his spotting scope and my rifle scope, we began the Methodical process of searching for any sign of the enemy sniper's position. There, Nash said quietly, pointing toward a rocky outcropping approximately 900 meters away. I saw muzzle flash. Ridge line just below that distinctive rock formation. I adjusted my rifle scope to focus on the area he'd indicated, scanning systematically for any sign of movement or unnatural shapes that might indicate a sniper hide. The distance was well within my capabilities, but the target was concealed in terrain that provided excellent camouflage. I don't see him, I admitted, frustration creeping into my voice as another shot rang out, this one striking dangerously. Close to our position. He's there, Nash insisted. Professional hide. Probably took him hours to construct. Look for shadow inconsistencies, equipment edges, anything that doesn't match the natural terrain pattern. As I continued searching through my scope, I became aware of the weight of the moment. This wasn't a training exercise or a competition shoot. Somewhere in those rocks was someone actively trying to kill my friends, and I might be the only person in our unit with the skills necessary to stop him. Movement. Nash's urgent whisper focused my attention on a specific area, where he detected something inconsistent with the surrounding terrain. 11 o'clock from the rock formation, maybe 50 meters down the slope. I shifted my scope to the indicated area and began the careful process of target identification. At 900 meters, distinguishing between rocks, shadows, and human shapes required patience and systematic observation. But gradually, I began to make out the outline of what appeared to be a carefully constructed shooting position. I think I see it, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Looks like a hide built into the natural rock formation. I can see what might be a rifle barrel. Can you make the shot? The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. This was the moment my father had tried to prepare me for, the transition from target shooting to combat, from paper silhouettes to human beings. Everything I'd trained for, everything I'd claimed to be ready for, came down to this single decision. Range 900 meters, wind from the southwest at maybe 8 miles per hour. Elevation advantage to the target, I calculated aloud, running through the mental checklist that had become automatic through thousands of practice shots. I can make it, then take the shot when you have it. I settled into a stable shooting position, controlling my breathing and finding that familiar space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived. Through my scope, I could see the target area with crystal clarity, the rocky outcropping, the shadows that might conceal an enemy fighter, and the slight inconsistency that suggested human presence. The enemy sniper moved a subtle shift that confirmed his position and presented a target window that might last only seconds. In that moment, I understood what my father had meant about the difference between courage and the absence of fear. I was terrified, but I was also focused with an intensity I'd never experienced. The shot broke clean, the rifle bucking against my shoulder with familiar authority. Through the scope, I watched the bullet's trace streak across the valley toward the target position. At 900 meters, flight time is roughly 1 second, enough time for doubt to creep in, for wind to shift, for all the variables I'd calculated to prove wrong. Hit, Nash confirmed through his spotting scope. Target down. No further movement from that position. The confirmation should have brought relief, but instead I felt a complex mixture of emotions that training had never addressed. Pride in the successful shot, relief that the threat to my unit had been eliminated, and an underlying awareness that I'd just taken a human life, even if that life belonged to someone who'd been trying to kill my friends. Outstanding shooting. Blackwood, Staff Sergeant Donovan said as he moved to our position. That was a hell of a shot under pressure. But it was Corporal Nash's quiet assessment that stayed with me. You just saved lives, he said simply. Remember that when you're processing what happened here. The convoy completed its mission that day, delivering supplies to the village school while medics treated Lieutenant Harris's wound. But for me, The mission marked a fundamental transition from soldier to combat veteran, from someone who claimed to be ready for war to someone who'd proven it under fire. That night, I called my father on the satellite phone, needing to hear the voice of someone who understood what I'd experienced. "How do you feel?" he asked after I described the day's events. "Proud and sick at the same time," I admitted. "Proud that I performed when it mattered, sick that someone had to die." "That's exactly how you should feel," he replied. "The day it stops bothering you is the day you should worry about yourself. But remember, you protected your brothers and sisters in arms. That's what warriors do." His words helped, but they didn't erase the weight of what had happened. I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, proven myself in a way that no training, exercise could replicate. But more importantly, I demonstrated to my unit that the small soldier from Montana could perform. When lives were on the line, the enemy sniper threat that had been terrorizing the region was neutralized, but intelligence reports suggested there were other threats developing. The Taliban weren't going to abandon their sniper tactics because one shooter had been eliminated. If anything, they would likely respond with increased aggression and more sophisticated tactics. 3 weeks later, those predictions would prove accurate when Forward Operating Base Sentinel came under siege by the largest Taliban force the region had seen in months. The skills I demonstrated during the convoy ambush would be tested again, but this time the stakes would be measured not in single lives, but in the survival of our entire base. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The intelligence reports started coming in 3 days before the attack. Fragmentary communications intercepts suggesting unusual Taliban movement in the mountains surrounding Phobe Sentinel. Local informants reported armed groups moving through villages at night, and surveillance drones detected what appeared to be weapons caches being established in positions that overlooked our base. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce called an emergency briefing for all company commanders and senior non-commissioned officers. The base's operations center, normally humming with routine radio traffic and administrative chatter, had taken on the focused intensity that comes when abstract threats become immediate dangers. "Gentlemen, ladies," Pierce began, standing before a tactical display that showed the terrain surrounding our position. "Intelligence suggests we're about to face a coordinated attack by Taliban forces significantly larger than anything we've encountered in this sector." He clicked through satellite imagery showing movement patterns that had developed over the past week. Estimates range from 150 to 300 fighters, equipped with heavy weapons, mortar, and what appears to be a coordinated command structure. "This isn't a harassment attack or probe. This is a deliberate attempt to overrun our position." Captain Sullivan, my company commander, raised his hand. "Sir, what's driving this level of commitment? Why risk this many fighters on a direct assault?" Pierce's expression grew grim. "The school reconstruction project we've been supporting has become a symbol of coalition success in the region. Intelligence suggests Taliban leadership views destroying our base as essential to maintaining their credibility with local populations. They're willing to accept significant casualties to achieve a propaganda victory." The briefing continued with defensive preparations, casualty evacuation procedures, and communication protocols for requesting additional support. But it was the discussion of expected enemy tactics that captured my attention most completely. "Based on previous attacks in other sectors, we can expect the assault to begin with indirect fire mortar and rocket-propelled grenades, targeting our defensive positions and communication equipment," Pierce explained. "This will be followed by coordinated small unit attacks from multiple directions, designed to identify weak points in our perimeter." Major Rodriguez, the base's intelligence officer, added crucial details about enemy capabilities. "The Taliban force includes experienced fighters who've been conducting operations in this region for years. They know our defensive positions, our patrol patterns, and our standard responses to contact. They've had time to plan this attack specifically against our capabilities. Staff Sergeant Donovan caught my attention as we filed out of the briefing. Blackwood, I want you and Nash positioned in the eastern observation tower during the attack. Your counter-sniper capabilities may be the difference between holding our perimeter and being overrun. The weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. 3 months earlier, I'd been serving coffee in Montana. Now I was being tasked with helping defend a military base against a coordinated enemy assault. The attack began at 0347 hours on a moonless night that provided perfect cover for Taliban movement. The first indication of trouble was the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds, followed by explosions that shattered the pre-dawn quiet and sent soldiers scrambling for defensive positions. All stations, this is Sentinel Base, we are under attack. Mortar incoming from multiple directions. The radio call from the operations center was almost drowned out by the sound of explosions walking across the base's central area. I reached the eastern observation tower as the second wave of mortar rounds impacted, each explosion illuminating the surrounding terrain in brief, hellish snapshots. Corporal Nash was already in position with his spotting scope, scanning the hills for muzzle flashes and target indicators. Multiple firing positions, he reported, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around us. Mortar from the north and east, direct fire from the southern ridgeline. This is coordinated as hell. Through my rifle scope, I could see muzzle flashes sparkling in the darkness like deadly fireflies. The Taliban had established firing positions at multiple locations, creating interlocking fields of fire that would make any movement across the base's open areas extremely dangerous. Nash, I've got what looks like a heavy weapons position on the eastern ridge. Range approximately 1,100 meters. I see it. Looks like a recoilless rifle or heavy machine gun. That position is going to tear up our eastern perimeter if we don't neutralize it. The shot that followed was more challenging than anything I'd attempted in combat. The target was partially concealed, the range was at the extreme edge of effective engagement distance, and I was shooting from a position that was receiving indirect fire. But the mathematical precision that my father had drilled into me took over, processing variables and calculating corrections with the mechanical efficiency of a computer. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, and through the scope I watched the trace streak across the valley toward the Taliban position. 2 seconds later, the heavy weapons fire from that location ceased abruptly. Target neutralized, Nash confirmed. But we've got bigger problems developing. He was right. The mortar attack had been preparation for the main assault, which was now developing from 3 directions simultaneously. Taliban fighters were advancing on our perimeter using fire and movement tactics that demonstrated military training and experience. Sentinel Base, this is Eastern Observation Post. I radioed to the operations center. We have approximately 50 fighters advancing on the eastern perimeter. They're using coordinated small unit tactics and appear well equipped. Copy Eastern Up. Engage targets of opportunity and provide overwatch for perimeter defense. What followed was the longest night of my life. For 6 hours, Nash and I provided precision fire support for our perimeter defense, engaging Taliban fighters who were attempting to breach our wire or establish positions for follow-on attacks. The targets were challenging, moving quickly, using terrain for concealment, and disappearing immediately after firing. But it was during the third wave of attacks that I encountered something that changed everything about how I understood warfare in Afghanistan. Through my scope, I identified a Taliban fighter directing the assault from a position approximately 800 meters away. He was using hand signals to coordinate movement between different groups, clearly functioning as a battlefield commander. Nash, I've got what looks like a commander coordinating the eastern assault. Should I engage? If he's directing the attack, he's a legitimate target. Take the shot. I settled into position and began the familiar process of calculating range, wind, and elevation. But as I prepared to engage, something made me pause. Through the scope, I could see the target clearly, a man probably in his 40s, dressed in local clothes, directing other fighters with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. For a moment that lasted, perhaps 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. I saw him not as a target, but as a human being. Someone who might have a family, who might believe he was defending his homeland against foreign invaders, who might be as committed to his cause as I was to mine. But then a mortar round exploded near our position, sending shrapnel clanging off. The tower's protective barriers and the philosophical considerations disappeared beneath the immediate reality of combat. This man was directing an attack that would kill my friends if successful. The shot was clean, dropping the Taliban commander and immediately disrupting the coordinated nature of the Eastern assault. Without central direction, the attacking fighters began to fall back toward their rally points, buying our perimeter defense crucial time to reorganize. "Outstanding shot," Nash said quietly. "That may have saved the eastern perimeter." As dawn broke over forward operating base Sentinel, the Taliban assault began to lose momentum. Daylight eliminated their movement advantages, and air support that had been unavailable during the night began arriving to provide close air support for our defensive positions, but the siege was far from over. Intelligence reports suggested the Taliban had suffered significant casualties, but remained committed to overrunning our position. The next phase of their attack would likely involve different tactics, possibly including the kind of precision sniper fire that had proven so effective during previous operations. What I didn't know was that among the Taliban force surrounding our base was a sniper whose skills rivaled my own, someone who'd been watching my performance during the night engagement and was now planning a direct challenge that would test everything I'd learned about combat shooting. The real battle for forward operating base Sentinel was just beginning. The second day of the siege brought a different kind of warfare, psychological as much as physical. The Taliban had shifted from direct assault to a more patient strategy, establishing positions in the surrounding hills and subjecting our base to constant harassment fire. Single shots from concealed positions, designed not necessarily to kill but to keep everyone on edge, never knowing when the next bullet might find its mark. It was during the morning briefing that Lieutenant Colonel Pierce delivered news that changed everything about our tactical situation. Intelligence has confirmed the presence of a Taliban sniper team in the eastern mountains, he announced, standing before a map marked with suspected enemy positions. This isn't the same threat we neutralized 3 weeks ago. This is someone new, someone who's been specifically brought in to counter our sniper capabilities. Major Rodriguez provided additional details that made the situation clear. The enemy sniper has been responsible for 3 coalition casualties in other sectors during the past month. All were precision shots at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. All targeted military personnel with specialized skills, medics, communication specialists, and in one case, a sniper. The implication was obvious. This wasn't random harassment fire. It was a deliberate hunting expedition with me as the primary target. The enemy knows we have an effective counter-sniper capability, Pierce continued, his eyes finding mine across the briefing room. They've brought in someone specifically to eliminate that threat. This has become a direct challenge between their shooter and ours. Staff Sergeant Donovan spoke up from the back of the room. "Sir, what are our options for dealing with this?" "Threat? Limited," Pierce admitted. "Air support can't effectively target a well-concealed sniper position without specific coordinates. Artillery is problematic in an area with civilian populations. Our best option is counter-sniper operations, locate and eliminate the threat using our own precision shooting capabilities." After the briefing, Corporal Nash and I spent 3 hours studying the terrain through high-powered optics, trying to Identify potential hide sites that an enemy sniper might use. The eastern mountains provided countless positions with good observation of our base, making the search both critical and nearly impossible. If I were setting up to observe this base, Nash said, scanning through his spotting scope, I'd want elevation advantage, multiple escape routes, and a position that doesn't fit obvious patterns. He pointed toward a series of rocky outcroppings, approximately 1,400 meters from our position. That ridgeline provides everything a sniper would want, but it's almost too obvious. A skilled shooter might choose something less apparent. As we continued our systematic search, I became aware of the psychological pressure that comes from knowing someone is hunting you specifically. Every movement across open areas of the base carried the risk of presenting a target to someone who'd proven capable of precision shots at extreme range. The enemy sniper announced his presence at 13:47 hours with a shot that struck the communications antenna on our operations center, a target that required both exceptional marksmanship and detailed knowledge of our base layout. The bullet punched through the antenna's mounting bracket, disrupting our primary communications link with higher headquarters. Contact. Sniper fire from the eastern mountains. Came the radio call that we'd been expecting, but dreading. Nash and I immediately moved to our observation position, beginning the methodical process of trying to locate a shooter who just demonstrated both his capabilities and his intentions. The shot had come from somewhere in the vast expanse of mountainous terrain that stretched to the horizon, providing countless potential firing positions. Did you see muzzle flash? I asked, scanning through my rifle scope. Negative. Professional. Hide, probably suppressed weapon. We're dealing with someone who knows what he's doing. 20 minutes later, a second shot struck the base's fuel storage area, punching through a protective barrier and demonstrating the enemy sniper's ability to hit specific targets at will. The psychological effect was immediate. Soldiers began moving more cautiously, understanding that somewhere in the mountains was someone actively hunting them. This guy is good, Nash admitted as we continued searching for any sign of the shooters. Position. He's engaging targets that disrupt our operations while avoiding exposure to counter-fire. Classic sniper tactics. The third shot was clearly directed at me personally. As I moved between observation positions, a bullet struck the concrete barrier inches from my head, sending chips of stone flying and leaving no doubt about the enemy sniper's primary target. The shot had been perfectly calculated, close enough to make the threat personal without risking a miss that might reveal his position. He's playing with us, I realized, understanding the psychological dimension of what was happening. He could have taken that shot if he'd wanted to. He's trying to get inside my head. Nash nodded grimly. It's working. You're thinking about him instead of focusing on finding him. That's exactly what he wants. The realization helped me refocus on the tactical problem rather than the personal threat. This was a contest between two precision shooters, but it was also about protecting my unit and maintaining our defensive capabilities. The enemy sniper was trying to eliminate our counter-sniper capability, which would leave our base vulnerable to systematic targeting of critical personnel and equipment. As afternoon faded toward evening, I found myself thinking about my father's lessons about patience and discipline under pressure. The best snipers aren't necessarily the best shots, he'd told me. They're the ones who can wait longer, think more clearly, and act more decisively when the moment comes. The enemy sniper had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship, but he'd also revealed information about his capabilities and tactics. The shots had come from different positions, suggesting he was moving between prepared hides. The targets he'd chosen showed detailed reconnaissance of our base layout. Most importantly, his decision to make the threat personal suggested a level of confidence that might lead to mistakes. Nash, I said as we prepared for what would likely be a long night of observation, I think our shooter is overconfident. He's taking shots that aren't necessary for tactical purposes. "He's showing off," explain. That shot at the communications antenna was militarily significant. The fuel storage shot was harassment. But the shot at me was personal. It didn't accomplish anything except announce his presence and capabilities. Nash considered this analysis. "So you think he's more interested in the challenge than the mission?" "I think he's skilled enough to believe he's untouchable." That kind of confidence usually leads to exposure eventually. As darkness fell over forward operating base Sentinel, both snipers settled in for what would become a patient game of observation and counter-observation. Somewhere in the mountains, an enemy shooter was preparing for continued operations against our base. In our observation tower, I was preparing to prove that skill matters more than reputation, and that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. The siege had become personal, but it had also become an opportunity to demonstrate that a small soldier from Montana could match skills with anyone, regardless of their experience or reputation. The next 24 hours would determine not just the outcome of our defensive battle, but the effectiveness of our entire counterinsurgency strategy in the region. What I didn't know was that the enemy sniper had been watching my performance for days, studying my techniques and preparing for a direct confrontation that would test everything I'd learned about precision shooting under extreme pressure. The real duel was about to begin, and the stakes had just increased beyond anything I could have imagined. Dawn of the third day brought intelligence that changed everything about our tactical situation. A pre-dawn drone surveillance mission had detected unusual Taliban movement in the mountains, not retreating, but consolidating around what appeared to be a major command position approximately 2,200 meters from our base. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce called an emergency briefing that would prove to be the most critical of the entire siege. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering news that would determine the outcome of our defensive battle. "Intelligence has identified what appears to be the Taliban's main command post for this operation." He clicked through drone imagery showing a complex of caves and defensive positions built into the mountainside. "This isn't just a firing position, it's a fortified command center from which they've been coordinating the entire siege. Taking out this position would effectively decapitate their command structure and end the coordinated nature of their attacks." Major Rodriguez provided additional details that made the tactical problem clear. "The position is well fortified and protected by multiple defensive layers. Airstrikes are problematic because of civilian villages in the immediate area. Artillery would require sustained bombardment that we can't maintain with our current ammunition supplies." Captain Sullivan raised the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, what are our options for neutralizing this target?" Pierce's answer would define the next phase of our defensive operations. "Intelligence suggests the Taliban commander is using a specific observation position to direct operations against our base. The position provides excellent visibility of our defensive layout, but it also presents a potential target for precision engagement." He paused, his eyes finding mine across the briefing room. "The range is approximately 2,200 meters. The target would be a single individual in a partially concealed position. Wind conditions are variable due to mountain terrain. It's an extremely challenging shot under ideal conditions, nearly impossible under combat stress." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that room understood what was being discussed, a shot at a range that exceeded anything attempted during the current conflict, targeting a high-value individual whose elimination could end the siege. "Private Blackwood," Pierce said formally, "based on your demonstrated marksmanship capabilities, you're our best option for attempting this engagement. But I need you to understand the stakes. Success could end this siege and save lives. Failure might reveal our capabilities to the enemy and eliminate our counter-sniper effectiveness." The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. 3 months earlier, I'd been serving coffee in Montana. Now I was being asked to attempt a shot that could determine the outcome of a military operation. Sir, I'll need to study the target area and assess conditions before committing to the attempt. Understood. You have 6 hours to prepare. Intelligence suggests the enemy commander uses the observation position for morning briefings around 1,200 hours. The next 6 hours were a compressed education in everything I'd never known about extreme long-range shooting. Corporal Nash and I spent the time studying wind patterns, calculating ballistic trajectories, and identifying every variable that could affect a shot at 2,200 meters. This is beyond anything we've attempted, Nash admitted as we worked through the mathematics. At this range, we're dealing with variables that don't factor into normal shooting Earth rotation. Atmospheric pressure changes, even temperature differentials along the bullet's flight path. The technical challenges were staggering. At 2,200 meters, the bullet would take approximately 2.8 seconds to reach the target, enough time for wind conditions to change, for the target to move, for any number of variables to turn a perfect shot into a complete miss. But it was the psychological pressure that presented the greatest challenge. This wasn't just about marksmanship, it was about performing under scrutiny that extended far beyond our base. Success would be analyzed by military strategists and used as evidence of American precision capabilities. Failure would be studied by enemy forces and used to develop countermeasures against our sniper operations. Blackwood, Staff Sergeant Donovan said as I prepared my equipment for the attempt, I need you to understand something. Nobody expects you to make this shot. The range is extreme, the conditions are challenging, and the target will only be exposed for seconds. If you miss, nobody's going to blame you. His words were meant to reduce pressure, but they had the opposite effect. I didn't want to attempt something where failure was expected and accepted. I wanted to attempt something that would prove definitively that excellent marksmanship could overcome any obstacle. At 11:47 hours, I was in position with my rifle, a precision weapon that had been modified with the most advanced optics available. Nash was beside me with his spotting scope, ready to provide wind calls and target verification. The observation post had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, creating an environment where I could focus completely on the technical demands of the shot. Through my scope, I could see the target area, a rocky ledge approximately 2,200 meters away, where intelligence suggested the Taliban commander would appear for his daily briefing. The distance was so extreme that the target area appeared as barely more than a speck, even through high-powered optics. Wind conditions are variable, Nash reported, reading atmospheric indicators through his spotting scope. Southwest at 8 to 12 miles per hour, with gusts up to 15. Temperature differential between our position and the target is creating heat shimmer that's going to affect visibility. I began the complex calculations required for extreme long-range shooting, processing variables that included not just wind and distance, but atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature gradients, and even the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation. At 2,200 meters, every factor that could be ignored at shorter ranges became critical. Target area is becoming active, Nash reported at 11:58 hours. I'm seeing movement around the observation position. Through my scope, I could detect subtle changes in the target area, shadows shifting, small movements that suggested human presence. But the range was so extreme that positive target identification remained nearly impossible. There, Nash's urgent whisper focused my attention on a specific area. Individual moving onto the observation ledge. Appears to be using optical equipment to observe our base. I shifted my scope to the indicated position and began the careful process of target verification. At 2,200 meters, distinguishing between rocks, equipment, and human shapes required patience and systematic observation. But gradually, I began to make out the outline of a figure positioned exactly where intelligence had predicted. Confirmed target, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was attempting. Individual on the observation ledge appears to be conducting surveillance of our position. Range 2,200 meters, wind southwest at 10 miles per hour with gusts, temperature differential creating moderate heat shimmer. Nash provided the final environmental assessment. You have a target window. I settled into the most stable shooting position I could achieve, controlling my breathing and finding that familiar space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived. But this was different from any shot I'd ever attempted. The target was barely visible, the range was at the absolute limit of the weapon's capability, and the environmental conditions were constantly changing. Through my scope, I could see the target figure clearly enough to confirm it was a human being conducting observation activities. Intelligence had been correct. This was the Taliban commander, using his daily briefing position to assess our defensive capabilities. The shot that followed would either end the siege of forward operating base Sentinel, or confirm that some targets are simply beyond human capability to engage. Everything I'd learned, everything I'd trained for, everything my father had taught me about precision and patience, came down to a single trigger pull that would travel 2,200 meters to determine the outcome of a battle. I squeezed the trigger with the gentle pressure of someone who understood that greatness lives in the smallest details, and sent everything I was toward a target that most people couldn't even see. The bullet's flight time to a target 2,200 meters away is approximately 2.8 seconds, enough time for doubt to creep in, for wind to shift, for all the variables I'd calculated to prove wrong. But in that eternal moment between trigger pull and impact, I felt the same certainty my father had taught me to find in the Montana mountains. When everything is perfect, you know it before the bullet arrives. The rifle's recoil rocked me back against the sandbags. The familiar sensation of a clean shot, accompanied by the knowledge that I'd done everything technically possible to ensure success. Through my scope, I watched the bullet's trace streak across the valley toward a target, so distant it appeared as barely more than a speck against the mountainside. Time, Nash called quietly, beginning the countdown that would determine whether months of preparation and years of training had culminated in success or failure. 2.8 seconds felt like an eternity, long enough to question every calculation, every environmental assessment, every assumption that had gone into the most challenging shot of my military career. Long enough to understand that this single bullet would determine not just the outcome of our defensive battle, but the reputation of American precision capabilities in Afghanistan. Impact, Nash confirmed through his spotting scope, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Target down, confirmed hit. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, flooding my system with a mixture of relief, pride, and the complex emotions that come from taking a human life at a distance that made the action feel almost abstract. I just eliminated a high-value target at a range that exceeded anything attempted during the current conflict, but it was what happened next that transformed exceptional marksmanship demonstration into something approaching military legend. Within minutes of the shot, radio intercepts began revealing the impact of eliminating the Taliban command structure. Without central coordination, the various fighting groups that had been conducting the siege began operating independently, their attacks becoming disorganized and increasingly ineffective. Sentinel Base, this is Overwatch, came the radio call from our aerial surveillance platform. We're observing significant enemy movement away from assault positions. Appears to be a general withdrawal from the area of operations. Lieutenant Colonel Pierce's voice carried a note of amazement as he processed the intelligence reports flowing into the operations center. All stations, Sentinel Base. Enemy forces appear to be breaking contact and withdrawing from the area. Maintain defensive positions, but prepare for possible pursuit operations. The siege of forward operating base Sentinel was ending not with a final assault or negotiated ceasefire, but with the sudden collapse of enemy organization following the elimination of their command structure. One shot had accomplished what 3 days of defensive fighting and massive expenditure of resources had been unable to achieve. But the true magnitude of what had happened only became clear over the following hours as intelligence assessments revealed the identity of the target. I'd eliminated. The Taliban commander hadn't just been directing the siege of our base, he'd been the regional military leader responsible for coordinating insurgent operations across 3 provinces. Major Rodriguez provided the full briefing during our after-action review. The individual eliminated by Private Blackwood's shot was Commander Hakim Zadran, one of the most senior Taliban military leaders in southern Afghanistan. His death has created a command vacuum that's disrupting insurgent operations across the entire region. The implications extended far beyond our immediate tactical situation. Zadran had been responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, managing weapons smuggling operations, and maintaining the network of relationships that enabled Taliban operations in areas where they lacked popular support. Intelligence suggests that eliminating Zadran has effectively ended coordinated Taliban resistance in this sector, Pierce explained. Without his leadership and organizational capabilities, the various fighting groups are operating independently and with significantly reduced effectiveness. Captain Sullivan added context that made the strategic impact clear. The reconstruction projects we've been supporting can now proceed without the level of insurgent interference we've been experiencing. Local tribal leaders who were intimidated into supporting the Taliban are now willing to work openly with coalition forces. The transformation was dramatic and immediate. Within a week of the shot, forward operating Base Sentinel transitioned from a besieged outpost to a hub for reconstruction and development activities. The school project that had been the original target of Taliban opposition was completed ahead of schedule, and additional projects were approved for areas that had previously been too dangerous for coalition operations. But for me personally, the impact was more complex than simple military success. I'd proven that exceptional marksmanship could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military operations couldn't accomplish. But I'd also crossed a line that separated precision shooting from targeted elimination of specific individuals. Psychological weight of that realization hit me during a quiet moment 2 days after the shot, when I found myself alone in the observation tower where everything had begun. Looking out at the mountains where Zadran had been directing operations against our base, I thought about the complexity of warfare in a place where individual actions could have consequences that rippled across entire regions. Corporal Nash found me there as evening fell over the Afghan landscape, bringing with him the kind of understanding that comes from shared experience under extreme pressure. "Second thoughts?" he asked, settling beside me with the comfortable silence of someone who didn't need words to communicate. "Not about the shot," I replied after a long pause. "That was the right decision under the circumstances. But I'm trying to process the magnitude of what happened. One bullet changed the strategic situation across 3 provinces. That's what precision weapons are designed to do," Nash said quietly. "Achieve maximum effect with minimum force. You eliminated a specific threat without the collateral damage that would have resulted from conventional operations." His words helped put the action in context, but they didn't eliminate the weight of understanding that my marksmanship skills had strategic implications that extended far beyond personal or unit defense. The recognition that followed was unprecedented for a soldier of my rank and experience. The 2,200-meter shot was officially documented as the longest confirmed sniper engagement in the Afghanistan conflict, and my actions during the siege earned commendations that opened doors to opportunities I'd never imagined. But more importantly, the success had proven that excellence in any field could overcome assumptions about who belongs where and what different people are capable of achieving. The small soldier from Montana had demonstrated capabilities that changed how military leadership thought about precision shooting and individual impact on strategic objectives. 3 weeks later, orders arrived that would take me away from forward, operating Base Sentinel, and toward opportunities that built on what I'd proven during the siege. The shot that ended a regional war had also begun a new chapter in my military career, one that would ultimately lead to training responsibilities and policy development roles that extended far beyond individual combat operations. As I prepared to leave Afghanistan, I thought about my father's words about service and the difference between being good at something and being great at it. The mountains of Helmand Province had taught me that greatness isn't just about technical skill. It's about applying that skill when the stakes are highest and the pressure is most intense. The girl who'd served coffee in Montana had become something that most people never imagined possible. But more importantly, she'd proven that potential has no predetermined face, no required background, and no traditional path. Sometimes the most important victories come from refusing to accept other people's limitations on what you're capable of achieving. 4 years have passed since that shot echoed across the mountains of Helmand Province, and the ripple effects continue to shape both military policy and my own understanding of what one person can accomplish when skill meets opportunity under the most demanding circumstances. The immediate recognition was overwhelming. The 2,200-meter engagement was officially certified as the longest confirmed sniper kill in the Afghanistan conflict, a record that stood not just as a measure of marksmanship, but as proof that precision weapons could achieve strategic objectives previously thought impossible. Within weeks, my story was being briefed at the Pentagon as an example of how individual excellence could generate effects far beyond unit-level operations. But it was the long-term changes that proved most significant. The Blackwood Protocol, developed based on lessons learned from the siege of forward operating Base Sentinel, fundamentally altered how the military approached precision shooting and strategic targeting. Instead of treating snipers as support elements for conventional operations, the new doctrine recognized precision shooting as a capability that could independently achieve strategic objectives. The protocol emphasized 3 key principles that emerged from my experience in Afghanistan. First, that exceptional marksmanship capabilities should be identified and developed regardless of the soldier's background or physical characteristics. Second, that precision weapons could achieve strategic effects without the collateral damage associated with conventional operations. And third, that individual excellence, properly applied, could generate military and political consequences far beyond what traditional force structure models predicted. More importantly, the military began actively recruiting and training soldiers from non-traditional backgrounds who demonstrated exceptional shooting skills. The assumption that snipers had to fit a certain physical or demographic profile was replaced by selection criteria based purely on demonstrated ability and potential for development. My transition from combat operations to training responsibilities began 6 months after returning from Afghanistan, when I was assigned to the Army Marksmanship Unit at Fort Benning. The position gave me the opportunity to develop training programs based on everything I'd learned about precision shooting under combat conditions. The students who came through my programs reflected the new approach to sniper selection. Sarah Martinez from East Los Angeles, whose experience hunting in urban environments translated perfectly to target identification in complex terrain. David Kim from Seattle, whose background in competitive shooting provided a foundation for military precision work. Jennifer Thompson from rural Alabama, whose family hunting traditions had developed skills that military training could refine into exceptional capabilities. Each of these soldiers faced the same skepticism I'd encountered: assumptions about who belonged in precision shooting roles and what different people were capable of achieving. But the success rates in my training programs proved that Excellence could be developed in anyone willing to commit to the discipline and mental focus that precision shooting required. The most rewarding part of my training role was watching students exceed their own expectations. Soldiers who'd been told they weren't suitable for sniper roles consistently achieved performance levels that surprised everyone, including themselves. The key was providing training that focused on developing fundamental skills rather than conforming to preconceived notions about what snipers should look like. But it was the policy changes at the institutional level that created the most lasting impact. The success of non-traditional soldiers in precision shooting roles led to broader reconsideration of military selection criteria across multiple specialties. Physical standards were adjusted to reflect job requirements rather than traditional assumptions. Training programs were modified to identify and develop potential rather than screen for conformity. The changes weren't limited to the military. Law enforcement agencies began adopting similar approaches to sniper selection, recognizing that the skills demonstrated in Afghanistan had applications to domestic security operations. The FBI's hostage rescue team, SWAT units across the country, and federal security agencies all implemented training programs based on principles developed through my experience and subsequent research. My current role as Director of Precision Shooting Development for the Department of Defense gives me oversight, responsibility for sniper training across all service branches. The position represents opportunities I never could have imagined when I was serving coffee in Montana, but it also carries the weight of ensuring that the lessons learned from my experience continue to benefit future generations of soldiers. Statistics tell part of the story. Since implementation of the Blackwood Protocol, the percentage of non-traditional candidates successfully completing sniper training has increased by 340%. More importantly, performance metrics show that these unconventional soldiers often outperform their traditional counterparts in specialized skills that modern warfare demands. But the real measure of success isn't found in statistics, it's found in the stories of individual soldiers who've been given opportunities they might never have received under the old system. Letters arrive regularly from soldiers whose careers were transformed by training programs that emphasized ability over appearance, potential over pedigree. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez wrote to tell me about the Taliban commander she'd eliminated during operations in eastern Afghanistan, a shot that saved her unit from a complex ambush. Private Michael Johnson described how his precision shooting skills had enabled successful completion of a hostage rescue operation that conventional tactics couldn't have achieved. Corporal Amanda Foster explained how her marksmanship had provided security for humanitarian operations in areas too dangerous for conventional force protection. Each story reminded me that the shot I'd taken in Helmand Province wasn't just about eliminating a specific threat. It was about proving that excellence has no predetermined characteristics, and that potential exists in places where most people never think to look. The personal satisfaction comes not from the recognition or the career opportunities, but from knowing that my experience has created pathways for others who might have been overlooked or dismissed based on assumptions about what warriors look like. The girl from Montana who was told she was too small for combat proved that size, background, and traditional expectations matter less than skill, determination, and the courage to attempt what others consider impossible. My father's words about service and precision echo through every training program I develop, every policy recommendation I make, and every conversation I have with soldiers who doubt their own capabilities. Excellence isn't about the weapon, it's about becoming so disciplined and focused that you can achieve precision under any circumstances. The mountains of Afghanistan taught me that individual actions can have strategic consequences, but they also taught me that the most important battles aren't always fought against external enemies. Sometimes the most significant victories come from proving that potential exists in unexpected places and that greatness can emerge from anywhere when given the opportunity to develop. The shot that ended a regional war also began a transformation in how the military understands human potential and individual excellence. 4 years later, that transformation continues, creating opportunities for soldiers who might never have been given the chance to prove what they're capable of achieving. The legacy isn't just about one impossible shot, it's about proving that impossible is often just another word for unexpected. And that excellence speaks louder than assumptions about who belongs where and what different people can accomplish when given the chance to succeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.